March 18, 1944. RAF Bomber Command Station, Lincolnshire. 3:47 p.m. The briefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool and the faint, medicinal tang of fierce sweat that no amount of ventilation could dispel. 200 men sat in wooden chairs arranged in precise rows, their faces turned toward the map at the front of the room. A map of Germany draped in red yarn that traced the route they would fly in 6 hours. The target was Hamburg. Again. The fourth raid in 2 weeks. Flight Lieutenant Andrew Mackenzie sat in the third row, hands folded in his lap, studying the route with the detached focus of someone performing a calculation he already knew would not balance. He was 23 years old, a pilot with the Royal Canadian Air Force flying Halifax bombers for 419 Squadron. This would be his 37th mission. He had 23 more to complete before his tour ended and he could go home. 23 missions. The number sat in his mind like a stone. The briefing officer, a group captain with a mustache like a push broom, finished describing the target, the flak concentrations, the expected fighter opposition. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, weather conditions are marginal. Icing possible above 12,000 feet. Questions? No one asked questions. There were never questions. The men filed out in silence, collected their gear, and walked across the wet tarmac toward the dispersal huts where the bombers waited like sleeping dragons, their metal skins beaded with rain. Mackenzie climbed into his Halifax and began the pre-flight check. Instruments. Controls. Fuel. Oil pressure. Everything by the book because the book was all that stood between you and the mathematics of death. His crew assembled around him. Navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, gunners, each man performing his own rituals, touching talismans, whispering prayers or profanities depending on temperament. The engines coughed to life. The propellers bit the air. And Mackenzie thought, as he had thought before every mission since his 15th, this might be the one. The odds said it would be. Eventually. The survival rate for bomber crews in RAF Bomber Command during World War II was among the lowest of any military service in history. Of the 125,000 airmen who served, 55,573 were killed in action, a death rate of 44.4%. For Canadian crews specifically, the numbers were even grimmer. Over 10,000 Canadian airmen died flying bombing missions over Europe, most of them before completing their mandatory 30-operation tour of duty. This was not a secret. The men knew. Command knew. The public, insulated by propaganda and distance, did not know, or chose not to think about it. But the crews understood the arithmetic. A standard tour was 30 missions, later increased to 35. Statistical analysis conducted by RAF planners calculated that the average bomber had approximately a 50% chance of completing a tour. This meant that every time you climbed into your aircraft, you were effectively flipping a coin. Heads, you survived the night. Tails, you died. Over the course of a tour, 30 nights, 30 coins flipped. The odds compounded. Most crews did not make it past their 20th mission. The men who did were called tour expired, a phrase that sounded like something had expired inside them, which was often true. Mackenzie had joined the RCAF in 1942, trained in Canada under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, and arrived in England in the summer of 1943. He had been young then, younger than 23, though the difference felt like decades. He had believed he would survive because the alternative was unthinkable. Now, 37 missions later, he no longer believed in survival. He simply acted as if he did, which was not the same thing but was close enough to keep him functional. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The bombers assembled over the English coast at dusk, forming into a stream that stretched for miles, hundreds of aircraft stacked at different altitudes, each one a few hundred feet from its neighbors, close enough for collision, far enough to pretend you were alone. Mackenzie's Halifax, designated K for King, took its position in the stream and climbed toward cruising altitude. The air grew thin and cold. Ice began forming on the wings, glittering in the moonlight like chain mail. They crossed the North Sea in darkness. Below, the water was black and featureless. Above, stars rotated slowly around Polaris. The only sound was the drone of engines, a bass note so constant it stopped being sound and became a physical presence, a vibration that made your bones hum. Mackenzie scanned the instruments. Altitude 18,000 feet. Airspeed 180 knots. Oil temperature normal. Everything nominal. Everything fine. He knew better than to trust it. The flak started over the Dutch coast, bursts of orange light blooming in the darkness like poisonous flowers. The bombers flew through it, accepting the risk because evasion was impossible. You simply held course and hoped the shell that had your name on it was addressed to someone else. The Halifax shuddered as concussive waves passed through the fuselage. Mackenzie gripped the yoke tighter and kept flying. Then the fighters came. They always came. German night fighters, Messerschmitt 110s and Junkers 88s, equipped with radar, cannon, and pilots who had been doing this long enough to know exactly where the bombers would be and how to kill them. The first Halifax went down 20 minutes from the target, a ball of flame that fell tumbling through the darkness like a burning comet. Then another. Then another. Mackenzie counted 5 aircraft lost before he forced himself to stop counting. His rear gunner called over the intercom, "Fighter, 6 o'clock low." Mackenzie did not turn to look. There was nothing he could do. The gunner would engage or they would die. Those were the options. The sound of the gunner's turret rotating was followed by the hammer stutter of machine guns. Tracers arced into the night. The fighter broke away. They had survived. For now. The raid on Hamburg lasted 43 minutes. The bombers dropped their payloads, thousands of tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, onto a city that was already a ruin, that had been bombed so many times the fires never fully went out. Mackenzie watched the explosions ripple across the ground below, bright and silent from this altitude, and felt nothing. He had felt something the first time, horror, guilt, a kind of nauseated fascination. Now he felt only the mechanical satisfaction of a job completed. The bomb aimer called, "Bombs away." Mackenzie turned the Halifax toward home. The return journey was worse. The fighters followed them, harrying the stream, picking off stragglers and damaged aircraft. Mackenzie's navigator plotted a course that avoided the heaviest flak concentrations, but avoidance was relative. They still flew through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, still felt the aircraft buck and shudder, still heard shrapnel pinging against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. They crossed the English coast at dawn. Mackenzie descended through cloud, broke into clear air, and saw the airfield spread out below, green fields, concrete runways, the clustered huts of the base. He brought the Halifax in for a landing, felt the wheels touch down, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 37 missions complete. 23 to go. He climbed out of the aircraft and stood on the tarmac, legs unsteady, hands trembling with adrenaline depletion. Around him, other crews were emerging from their bombers, performing the same ritual, checking for damage, counting who had made it back, not speaking about the empty dispersal points where aircraft should have been but weren't. Of the 21 bombers from 419 Squadron that had taken off the previous evening, 18 had returned. 3 had been lost. 21 men dead. Mackenzie had known some of them. He would forget them by next week. You had to. Remembering was a luxury you couldn't afford. The reason Canadian bomber crews had such high casualty rates was not a single factor but a convergence of strategic, tactical, and technological realities. RAF Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, had committed to a doctrine of area bombing, striking industrial cities at night to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. Night bombing required flying in darkness, often through clouds, using primitive navigation equipment that made precision impossible. Bombers flew in loose formations, vulnerable to fighters and flak. The German Defense Network, a system of radar stations, searchlights, anti-aircraft batteries, and night fighter squadrons, was the most sophisticated in the world. Every raid was a gauntlet. The bombers themselves were inadequate. The Halifax, the Lancaster, the Wellington, these were large, slow, underarmed aircraft designed to carry bombs, not to survive combat. They were sitting targets. Their defensive armament, machine guns operated by gunners cramped in turrets, was insufficient against cannon-armed fighters attacking from below or head-on. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire could shred a bomber's wing, ignite its fuel tanks, or kill the pilot instantly. Crews had no parachutes in the traditional sense. They had chest packs that clipped onto harnesses, but in the chaos of a burning aircraft spinning out of control, the chances of successfully bailing out were slim. Most men who died did so inside their aircraft, either killed by enemy fire or trapped as the plane disintegrated around them. Mackenzie had seen this happen. On his 19th mission, the Halifax flying beside him had taken a direct flak hit to the nose. The aircraft had simply come apart, wings folding up, fuselage breaking in half, men spilling out into the darkness like rag dolls. None of them had deployed parachutes. Mackenzie had watched until the wreckage vanished into clouds, and then he had continued flying because that was the only thing he could do. Life on the base existed in a strange duality. During the day, the men tried to pretend they were normal, playing cards, writing letters, attending lectures on navigation or gunnery. But at night, when the briefings came and the missions launched, the pretense collapsed. Everyone knew the odds. Everyone carried the knowledge that most of them would not survive the war. Mackenzie developed routines to manage the fear. He wrote letters to his family in Ontario every Sunday, carefully editing out anything that might reveal the reality of his situation. He attended church services even though he had stopped believing in God sometime around his 10th mission. He drank in the officer's mess, not enough to impair his flying, but enough to dull the edges of memory. He also kept a logbook, not the official one mandated by the RAF, but a private journal where he recorded his thoughts in terse, abbreviated sentences. On the night of his 40th mission he wrote, "Hamburg again. Lost 2 from the squadron. Jensen and McKay. Both good men. Don't remember their faces anymore. Weather cold. Engines performed well. Home by 0400. There was no emotion in the entry. Emotion was dangerous. It opened doors you couldn't close. The psychological toll was immense. Bomber crews operated under a strain that psychologists would later recognize as unsustainable. Every mission was a brush with death. Every return was temporary reprieve, not safety. The men existed in a state of chronic hypervigilance, their nervous systems locked in fight or flight mode for hours at a time, night after night, until exhaustion became a baseline condition. Some men broke. They would freeze at briefings, unable to board their aircraft. They would vomit uncontrollably before takeoff. They would weep in the night, inconsolable. The RAF called it lack of moral fiber, LMF, a bureaucratic euphemism that meant cowardice. Men diagnosed with LMF were stripped of their rank, removed from flight status, and often sent to perform menial labor for the duration of the war. It was a scarlet letter, a public shaming designed to prevent others from succumbing to fear. Mackenzie had seen men taken away, their faces gray with shame and relief. He understood. Part of him envied them. But he kept flying because the alternative, admitting he was afraid, was worse than death. On his 45th mission, Mackenzie's Halifax was hit. A night fighter attacked from below, cannon shells ripping through the fuselage and severing hydraulic lines. The controls went slack in Mackenzie's hands. The aircraft began to spiral. He fought it, pulled back on the yoke, adjusted trim, used engine power to compensate for the lost hydraulics. The Halifax shuddered, groaned, and slowly, agonizingly, leveled out. He was flying manually now, every correction requiring physical force, his arms burning with effort. The navigator called over the intercom, "We're losing altitude. Can you hold her?" "I can hold her," Mackenzie said. They limped back across the North Sea at 8,000 feet, losing altitude gradually, the engine straining. The fighter did not return. Perhaps it had run out of ammunition. Perhaps it had decided they were already dead. Either way, Mackenzie nursed the damaged bomber across the water, coaxing it to stay airborne through sheer force of will. They reached the English coast with 2,000 feet of altitude remaining. Mackenzie called the tower, declared an emergency, and lined up for an approach. The landing gear deployed, a minor miracle, but the brakes were gone. The Halifax touched down, rolled the length of the runway, and skidded off into the grass, finally coming to rest 50 meters from a line of parked fuel trucks. Mackenzie sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the yoke, and realized he was laughing. Not from joy. From the sheer absurdity of survival. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. By the spring of 1945, Mackenzie had completed 56 missions, far exceeding the required tour. He had been offered a transfer to a training command, a safe posting where he could teach new pilots and never fly combat again. He declined. He did not know why. Perhaps because leaving felt like abandoning his crew. Perhaps because the war had become the only reality he understood, and returning to civilian life seemed more terrifying than continuing to flip the coin. He flew his 60th mission on April 19, 1945, a raid on a railway junction in Bavaria. The flak was light. No fighters appeared. They dropped their bombs and returned to base without incident. It felt anticlimactic. After 60 chances to die, he had expected the end to be dramatic. Instead, it was mundane. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. Mackenzie and his crew attended the VE Day celebrations in London, drinking in pubs packed with soldiers and civilians, everyone singing and crying and kissing strangers. Mackenzie felt nothing. He stood in the crowd, holding a pint of warm beer, and thought about the men who had not made it, the crews who had died on their 5th mission, their 15th, their 29th. He thought about the arbitrary nature of survival. He thought about luck, which was the only thing that separated the living from the dead. Mackenzie returned to Canada in June 1945. He was given a medal, a discharge certificate, and a train ticket to Toronto. He went home to his parents' house in Kingston and tried to resume the life he had left 3 years earlier. It was impossible. The world had not changed. He could not sleep without hearing the sound of engines. He could not see a clear night sky without calculating altitude and airspeed and plotting imaginary routes through darkness. He could not hear thunder without flinching, his body bracing for the impact of flak. He told no one. What would he say? That he had flown 60 missions over Germany and lived? That he had watched friends die and felt relief it wasn't him? That survival felt less like victory and more like guilt? He found work as a commercial pilot, flying mail routes across Ontario. The cockpit was familiar. The solitude was comforting. He flew alone at low altitude, where the air was warm and the stars were distant, and tried not to think about the war. In 1953, Mackenzie received a letter from his former navigator, who had tracked him down through veterans' records. The letter was brief. Still here. Still flying. Thought you'd want to know. Hope you're well. Mackenzie wrote back. They began corresponding sporadically, exchanging updates about jobs, families, the ordinary details of lives that had somehow continued past the point where they should have ended. Neither man mentioned the war directly. They didn't need to. The shared experience sat between them like a third presence, invisible but undeniable. In 1968, Mackenzie attended a reunion of 419 Squadron. 30 men showed up, 30 out of the hundreds who had served. They sat in a hotel conference room and drank coffee and told stories that softened the edges of memory, turning horror into anecdote. Someone mentioned the Hamburg raids. Someone else talked about the time their aircraft lost 2 engines and made it home on pure stubbornness. An older man, Mackenzie didn't recognize him, raised his glass and said, "To the ones who didn't make it." Everyone drank. The room went quiet. Mackenzie thought, we were supposed to die. All of us. The fact that we're here is statistical noise. The question of why Canadian bomber crews had such high casualty rates has been debated by historians for decades. The strategic bombing campaign was necessary, they argue, to weaken Germany's industrial capacity and force the Luftwaffe to divert resources to home defense. The lives lost were the price of victory. But for the men who flew those missions, strategy was an abstraction. They knew only that they climbed into aircraft night after night, flew into darkness filled with fire and metal, and watched their friends die for objectives that seemed to make no difference. Hamburg was bombed 50 times. It kept producing war material. Berlin was bombed dozens of times. It did not surrender. The raids continued because stopping them would mean admitting they had been futile, and futility was not something command could acknowledge. Mackenzie in his final years would say, "We knew we were doomed. We flew anyway. Not because we were brave. Because we had no choice. And because someone had to." It was not heroic. It was not glorious. It was mathematics. 60 nights. 60 chances to die. The fact that some men survived was not a testament to skill or courage, though both were required, but to luck, which distributed itself without regard for merit. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the battles that define us aren't always fought with bullets, and the victories that last aren't always written in history books. Mackenzie died in 1987 at the age of 66. His obituary mentioned his service with 419 Squadron, his 60 missions, his medals. It did not mention the nightmares that never fully stopped, or the way he would wake sometimes in the dark and reach for controls that weren't there, or the guilt that came from surviving when so many others had not. His family found his logbook among his possessions, the private one, not the official record. They read the entries, terse, factual, drained of emotion. On the final page, dated April 19, 1945, he had written, 60 missions complete. Home by 0345. Clear night. Stars visible. Still here. Don't know why. That, perhaps, is the answer. They flew because they had to. They survived because luck, indifferent and arbitrary, allowed it. And they lived the rest of their lives carrying the knowledge that they were statistically dead men, anomalies who had slipped through cracks in the mathematics of attrition. The war had taught them fear. Survival taught them that fear was justified. And the years that followed taught them that living past the point where you were supposed to die does not erase the fact that you should have died. It only means you carry the weight of those who did. They braced for death every night. And every morning that they woke, still breathing, still whole, they faced the same question. Why me? Why not them? There was no answer. Only the next mission. The next night. The next coin flip. Until, against all odds, the flipping stopped. And they were left standing in the sudden, disorienting silence of peace, wondering what to do with a life they had never expected to keep. The engines fell silent. Eventually. But the sound never left.